everyone, and welcome back to our discussion on what's going on around the world in AI. And I am delighted to welcome to our mostly online panel, Ulrik Vestergaard Knudsen, Deputy Secretary General for the OECD, former Permanent Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs from Denmark, Ami Appelbaum, Chairman of the Israel Innovation Authority at the Ministry of Economy, Courtney Bowman, who's Director of Privacy and Civil Liberties Engineering at Palantir Technologies, and the one and only Ryan Heath, from Senior Editor at Politico in the United States. Thanks very much for joining our panel today on what's going on around the world. I'd first like to get us started by jumping off of the discussion we just had with Mrs. Vestager about our values on AI. And I wondered if you just, from the OECD, if we could bounce off this idea of things that we don't want, things like social scoring. Are there things about AI that we can agree on almost globally that we are concerned about and that we would like to say, actually, our values don't accept that use of AI or surveillance?
Thank you. I have a little bit of difficulty hearing because I think I'm on a Zoom connection to your vMix platform. But I think you asked me to talk a little bit about how we see the issue of the nexus between values and AI. I think one of our proudest achievement at the OECD in this area over the last 2 years was the formation of what was first the OECD principles on artificial intelligence, are actually on trustworthy use of artificial intelligence. This started as a project among the 37 OECD members, plus a few others, where we gathered experts from our member countries. And I have to admit, maybe even a little bit to our own surprise, within a matter of relatively few months, we managed to get agreement around a set of principles for trustworthy use of AI on values such as human rights, transparency, explainability, and so on. And then to our even further surprise, actually the G20 later last year at the summit in Osaka adopted these principles. So it means that in a time where multilateralism and international cooperation is under strain and it's difficult to produce results, if you start with soft law, if you start with principles, if you let civic society and academia join the discussion, it is actually possible to reach some sort of consensus. Now, your next question would rightfully be, well, is it not because they're so watered down and so abstract that anyone can agree to them? And of course, there is some truth in that criticism. But nonetheless, I think it's quite an achievement that we managed, first at the OECD and then at G20, to agree on this set of principles. We did not agree on all the policy advice that was also coming out of this process. That's still only for OECD, so there's a way to go. But still, there is scope for bringing the value discussion into the AI sphere and also for creating diplomatic results, if you like.
Ryan, did you want to step in to talk about what we actually agree on? Go for it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually a quick follow-up to Ulrik before we get into what some of the major powers agree on. Ulrik, when I was reading about the OECD partnership, and I read yesterday that the US and the UK have signed a research cooperation agreement on AI, it in a strange way reminded me about all of the fragmented efforts to address climate change. Now, I'm not making a direct analogy here. It's just that as different governments have struggled to come up with a common regulatory approach on climate change, you see all of these fragmented initiatives which look positive on the surface, and then you wonder, where's the next layer? Where is the substance that's really going to do something to, help the climate? And in this case, I'm talking about making sure we have responsible AI. How are you going to make sure you continue working with the G20? How do you make sure that the US and the UK aren't undercutting you by that bilateral agreement? How are we going to really make sure that there is substance there going forward is my follow-up question to you. And then a general one to everyone about what you consider the world's AI powers as actually agreeing on.
Well, let me be honest with you. There is I think the analogy is fine, actually. There is a reason why it's difficult for the world to agree on binding climate targets. There is a reason why the world has not, since 1994, agreed on a new multilateral round of trade negotiations. The WTO is in crisis. There is a reason why major powers are criticizing the UN and leaving some of its bodies. So it's no surprise that on a topic like AI, which cuts across competition, economy, security policy, privacy, sovereignty, and so on, I don't think it's a surprise that we don't get very strict rules agreed to by 200 countries on AI. So I think in a time where there is perhaps more need for international cooperation than ever before, be it climate, trade, AI, whatever, and at the same time, the multilateral system is in a crisis. Maybe the way forward is for plurilateral agreements, that is, agreements among fewer countries, and perhaps soft law rather than hard law. Maybe this is as far as we can get right now. Maybe these are stepping stones or building blocks towards multilateralism in a more traditional sense. So I think the analogy is actually pretty relevant, but we have to look at the glass as half full and not half empty, even though both approaches would have some truth to them.
Well, just to follow up on that, one difference we can say is that on climate change, there are some countries that are more advanced and others are saying, well, we need time to catch up. In terms of AI, at least for China or parts of the world, actually just as advanced or even more so. And yet we can see there's a sort of a divide. And some people have described the work at GPI, the Global Partnership on AI, as a form of Western alliance on AI principles. I'm just curious how you think, is there a divide? Should we be concerned about a divide opening up on the use of AI in the world? And what ways are there to kind of bridge that over and address the divide?
You're right. There is also the GPAI, the Global Partnership for AI. This was started as a G7 proposal driven by France and Canada. Now I think there are about 13 countries who've signed up. Not only G7 countries, not only rich economies. India is also there. So again, I think this is an example of some like-minded countries coming together, and then hopefully others will join. In this case, India. So I think we support definitely the GPAI. The OECD is also now secretariat because there's so many win-wins and synergies between this and the other work that we're doing on the principles. Having said that, yes, I agree that of course there is a fragmentation already, and of course there is a risk of a divide. And this is not only a divide between rich and the poor; it's also maybe even a geopolitical divide. When we look at AI and data privacy issues, there is maybe this tendency that in the US, the political orthodoxy is that the companies own our data. In Europe, we would say that no, it's the individuals, the consumers, the voters, if you like, who own the data. In China, they would say it's the state or the party. And then there is a divide to maybe the rest of the world or the least developed countries because they don't have these data gathered. So this is a rather abstract or perhaps even futile discussion for them because they're not privileged to even have a policy on this since they don't have a data collection like we do. So yes, there is this tendency to a splinter net. Some people also call it. But I don't think that should dissuade us from trying to work together. We're going to talk, I think, later about also the divide between the US and the EU, and both the AI principles and the GPAI are examples of the US and EU working together.
Maybe Ryan, you want to follow us up on that because we have someone from the US here with us.
Absolutely. Courtney, could I probe you on that a little bit? Because, if we think about Palantir in the public image, it presents itself as the very freewheeling, we don't need regulation on us approach to technology. You get a lot of criticism from privacy activists for going to those edges of how to exploit data. And that sets you at odds with organizations like the European Commission often, or even the Californian state government when it comes to their privacy bill. Can you lay out why you think your approach and the freedom that it requires is better than the approach that would see us regulate and limit the way AI is used?
Actually, we're very much in favor of broad regulation as a company. And to provide some clarification, Palantir is not, strictly speaking, an artificial intelligence company. What we provide is data infrastructure for institutions to manage their data more responsibly and to carry out advanced analytics tasks like artificial intelligence development in a way that's consistent with regulatory principles in the EU, in the US, and in other jurisdictions. So we built an enterprise and platforms and software around this concept of enabling our customers to be able to be compliant with the most rigorous regulatory standards across the globe. So generally speaking, we're very supportive of both principled approaches, and we acknowledge from our practitioner perspective and having worked in a number of different domains that there's a lot of brittleness to artificial intelligence applications. And to get it right, it really does make sense to start at a sectoral approach to understand the context of any given AI application and make sure that you have the flexibility and the configurability to build solutions that address the specific regulatory environments in which you're operating.
And who do you think is doing that best at the moment? Is it one of the American states? Is it the OECD?
I think everyone's sort of making a go at it and doing their best at the moment. I think it's important to acknowledge that artificial intelligence is not a monolithic concept. We're not dealing with a single type of technology. We're dealing with a family of technologies. And each of those technology components requires different approaches. So when you start to break that down, you realize that brittleness tends towards different methods in different applications, whether you're dealing with deterministic or non-deterministic systems. Even within specific applications like computer vision, recognizing that detecting cats doesn't make you competent, much less responsible, when it comes to doing facial recognition. You have to acknowledge those limitations of what the technology is capable of doing, and then use that recognition to build out competent approaches. So I think across the Atlantic and more globally, a lot of different jurisdictions are trying to figure out those sector-specific approaches, cognizant of the specific context, the risks in those contexts, the existing regulatory landscapes, and then anticipating what the normative concepts are going to be that figure into the next level of regulation that will affect industry and government and other players in the space.
Just a very quick follow-up. We heard Mrs. Vestager talking a minute ago about social scoring, and she said quite spontaneously, well, I don't think that really has a place here in Europe. That's not how we really see our values. Are there things that we can just agree on that may not be respectful of just very basic principles on sort of respect of human rights and a right to privacy? Should those be elevated to international principles that we all abide by? That's questions for you, Mr. Bowman. Sorry, didn't make that too clear. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think we do generally agree that there's a right to privacy that accrues to everyone. We recognize that right in the U.S. It's certainly enshrined in the landscape in the EU. There are other global jurisdictions that maybe don't have the same notion of privacy. We have to recognize that privacy also has a cultural dimension, so there are different flavors of how you consider privacy. But there are fundamental rights that I think are acknowledged across the board. And I think there are ways that we can inculcate and reinforce those concepts in the approaches that we take with artificial intelligence and other advanced applications of data science. Now, specifically with respect to social scoring, I think similar to the EU, that concept is anathema in the US. I don't think there's many people, many jurisdictions, many applications where folks would sign on to that concept. And I don't see it taking root in the United States anytime soon.
Thanks. Just a brief break. We are interactive. I have one question here, but I would love to see a lot more questions. Please feel free to get into this discussion and have us read out your questions because that's part of my job up here. But before we get to that, I want to turn to you, Ami. Thanks for waiting patiently. I don't know if you're in the office or at home. I know there's a new lockdown in Israel, if it's effective yet. I wanted to ask you, as a hyper savvy tech nation, what is Israel's AI strategy? If you want to just explain it briefly to us, and then we also talked about some of the ways that AI can be used for good. Maybe you can lead us into that discussion.
So thank you very much. Yes, we are again in a lockdown. However, we are trying to keep the economy going. So many of the non-crowd serving workplace are open, like factories and so on. Restaurants and gym and those areas are closed. Regarding the Israel strategy, I think what we have to realize first, that when we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about a platform, a very large platform that's serving very many different segments in all aspects of life. I would argue that matter of few, there will be no segment of our life that will not be influenced or activating some way or some kind of artificial intelligence. Therefore, when you ask what is the country's strategy, I would say in one word, to be the best. Question is, how do you do that? That said, to be the best and the most ugliest one, you definitely don't want. What this means is all the regulation, and we are respecting all the value that the Western world is respecting. And that means that we got to go hand to hand on the many different segments of artificial intelligence with the regulators in Israel on one end, with the regulators in the US on the other end, and with the OECD, with the EU regulators on the third. So it is, and that's kind of something that we are investing extensively. But as I said, every segment of our life will be affected. You cannot do it all. So matter that now I would say COVID-19 just shows us matters of personal data and the medical data and personal medical files that say that you want the privacy. On the other hand, if you want to know why certain people are getting affected or infected by COVID-19 and reacting much harder than others, you may want to go into their genomic data. Well, now you very quickly run into privacy and personal data. Then that creates many, I would say, initiatives how you can anonymize data and how you can, one hand, get the data, on the other hand, not to violate all the privacy that we want. So we set up in Israel a committee that composed representatives from the government, from the industry, from the academia, and from the defense force. That structure, defense force, primarily for the dual usage, because defense have their own, I would say, needs and regulation and confidentiality and security that we cannot put it in one bucket. So that committee is actually in a process now to define what should be Israel's strategy, I would say, in terms of activities and budget. So go to what I started, try to be the best. And being the best is, I want to stay humble. It's only Israel. It's 9 million people. You cannot be the best when you compare to US, to China, to Europe. That said, then what is the incremental advantage we can bring that will put us ahead? And that's what we are working on.
Ami, thanks. I wanted to go back to something we said when we spoke before this panel. You said one thing that's clear is you're not going to do what the EU is doing. It's going to, if there are rules, they're going to address market failures, and that Israel is not going to lay out hard legislation on what you can or cannot do on AI. Could you tell us a little bit about what the spirit of the approach to AI is in Israel so far?
Sorry, I'm not sure I got to the bottom of your questions.
No, the question is hard rules, which is what we're doing here in the EU. Does Israel agree with that? Does Israel think there should be laws on how we apply AI at this stage?
At this stage, what we do is I would call it, we're educating our regulators on one end. Proactively, we don't wait that we have some conflict with the value that we may face. We proactively getting together with the regulators to bring them up to speed. We are working jointly with the OECD and with the US. As you may know, there is a National Security Commission for AI that in the US. We're working with them. And what we want is I would say, to educate ourselves before we define the action plan. We are still in the plan. That said, there are elements in artificial intelligence, for example, for autonomous car. So I don't think you can talk about the whole AI in one segment. There are a couple of set of values that we all respect and we are not going to violate. That said, the regulation for autonomous car might be very, very different from regulation to medical data. But what we push in my position as a head of Israel Innovation Authority is not to wait till the technology runs forward and then bring the regulators, but rather bring the regulator upfront, give them as much data as the technologists know, and let them sit on it and start to digest it. So when time comes and you have to put the regulation for autonomous car and car running on the road and it's unavoidable car accident, there is some artificial intelligence mechanism that will decide this one will die and this damage will be caused and this one will stay alive. Well, God forbid for whoever have to make these decisions, but no doubt we come to this point. So how do you do all of that?
Yeah.
So I think in my message for all of that, we got to work globally. We got to work jointly. There is no one unilateral approach and only OECD right and US wrong or vice versa. It's got to be. And I wish that also the Chinese and the Russians will join us and we all agree on some set of rules that no one will be willing to violate.
Thanks for giving us a really concrete example there of where AI rules can work. Ryan, do you have any thoughts you want to pitch in? Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on this idea of working jointly and the point about market failures and connect it back to the competition with China. So maybe the context for my thought there, which is that if 2020 has taught us anything, it's that it's very hard to separate economics and politics. We see that in the pandemic mostly now, but one of the big undercurrents there is the West's seeming inability to compete with China. And then the underlying fact that often China isn't competing on a market level playing field. The Chinese Communist government doesn't step back and just hope for the best when it comes to a lot of the strategic developments in the world. So my question there is one of the points of commonality, one of the areas where a lot of Western countries at least could agree to work together is on addressing market failures, on building some markets that aren't obviously going to get off the ground. And because I think the backdrop there is that China is going to be going and building them with state money if we aren't working collectively together. What do you see as the scope for government intervention there to make sure that democracies aren't left in the dust to China? Maybe Ulrich, you can go first.
Sure. No, I would just echo that we need cooperation. We need joint answers, and that's not only on tech; it's also on trade and climate. But nobody today has mentioned the looming Cold War, and I am a little bit reluctant to be the first to go there. So I don't want to state that we are in the midst of a Cold War. But I think if you talk to many commentators in Washington and Beijing, they have accepted the fact that we are in a new type of Cold War, whereas the Europeans are still asking themselves the question, how can we avoid a new Cold War? That may be naive on the part of Europe. It's an open question I put out there. But whether we call it geopolitical tension or a new Cold War, we see certainly friction playing out in arenas such as tech and trade and territory even. And I think we would be naive, at least, if we did not see this whole discussion about AI and values and democracy in the West in the light of a possible Cold War. That is just a fact. You can just open your paper every day and you see how these tech issues are related to issues of national security and values and so on. So while we should not abandon the hope of joining forces globally, and I remind you that Russia and China also signed up to the G20 principles, but of course, when they sign up to principles based on human rights and democracy, they probably have a different approach, let me put it that way, diplomatically, to human rights and democracy than, for example, the EU or the US. So I think we're going to see cooperation in different spheres. At least from our side, the OECD, we will be committed to trying still to forge truly global solutions where we bring on board everyone. But then I think it's also fair to say that the differences between, for example, the US and the EU on this are more easily reconcilable than the differences, say, between the US and China. AI applications are by nature, if you like, born global. You cannot confine AI applications behind borders, but the regulation is made by sovereign nation states, or in Europe's or for Europe, it's then continental rules, if you like. So there is this schisma between the born global nature of AI and then the national nature of regulation. And that we'll have to reconcile. We've had differences between the EU and the US for a long time on trade, going back to the 90s, and whether we can eat hormone beefs or how we produce bananas and so on. So I think between the EU and the US, I don't want to downplay it, but we have a history of working together when we don't see eye to eye exactly on regulation. We have a history of finding solutions. I'm a little bit more worried about the bigger global geopolitical tension picture.
Okay. Thanks, Ulrich. I saw you nodding along, Courtney, so I'm gonna get to you next on that question. I do want to remind people, first of all, we have a poll that is active right now, which is what should the EU prioritize to become a global player on AI? It's active. You can respond in the app, and we're still taking questions. So a two-part one, just very quickly. We've only got 3 minutes, but one. The EU-US alliance, I saw you nodding along on that to our AI values. And here's an interesting kind of provocative question from the audience, which is, what is the danger if we've got one power racing way ahead of all the others to become dominant on AI? Where does that put us as a global community if you've got one really super dominant power on AI technology?
Yeah, I was nodding because I largely agree with Ulrich's remarks. I think there's not a lot of daylight between the values that direct our approaches to artificial intelligence and any advanced analytics in the US and the EU. And there's too much cultural alignment, there's too much political alignment, there's too much economic synergies for there to be significant division across the Atlantic. So what that means in practice is that I think we're largely going to have similar constructs for approaching different risk scenarios in various applications of artificial intelligence. and largely we'll get to coherent views about how we approach these questions. When it comes to the broader global race, and specifically, I think Ulrich is also right that there is a Cold War that's brewing between the West broadly defined and specifically China. I think it's actually our commitment to a values-oriented approach to artificial intelligence that will define ultimately our advantage. And this is a key point because I think a lot of the discussion seems to be centered around the supposed advantage that China holds because they're unbridled by access to data. And they're unbridled by access to data because they have less regulatory considerations, less privacy data protection considerations. But the reality is to build competent, capable AI, it's not just a matter of pure data accumulation. It's not a matter of volume. This comes down to responsible AI practices that actually align very closely with good data science. And good data science requires smart approaches to managing the data that you have, not to accumulate a massive amount of data. You can build very competent artificial intelligence and other analytic systems through relatively small volume of data, but it really comes down to having the infrastructure in place to carry out those practices. And the extent to which our approach to a values-oriented method of looking at our artificial intelligence, regulating to some degree, and also thinking through the normative considerations of the use of this technology allows us to reinforce those sound data science principles. I think we're in a strong position to address this global divide.
Thanks a lot. And just in the 20 seconds we have left, I'm just going to open question. How can we make sure that those values are respected on the world stage? I mean, we can try to come to an agreement in GPI, but should we be pushing harder on respect of privacy, on the use of AI, and say, well, if you don't do that, we're actually going to take other measures that are going to impose. Is this going to become a harder fight? Is what I'm going to say. What I mean about the AI principles and ethics. Is this something where we need to get a little bit tougher to put these principles up front? I can turn to you, Ulrich. We're almost out of time, but just a very quick answer.
Right. No, I think we're in for a fight here. I just want to say that at the OECD, we have this year, we followed up our work on the principles with an OECD observatory, AI observatory, where we bring together all these different approaches, academia, business, countries, to see if we can build on those principles to turn it into implementation. So yes, this is going to be a fight, and we're going to have to keep working for it. And at the OECD, we're committed to do so. And just the other question, very last thing I'll say, is there a reason to be fearful of a dominant AI superpower? I would say in general, yes. And then as a European, specifically, even more so, since there's absolutely no sign that it's the EU that's going to be that runaway superpower on AI.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ulrich. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Ami. Thank you, Ryan. That was a great chat. We're going to be meeting up pretty shortly for our next session, which is about AI and epidemics. That's might be of interest to you, Ami, how it can help you out of lockdown. Please stay connected. Dial in on the poll, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you.